So we get back to this issue of only human beings go around saying, is this a construction? Or, that there's something about human beings that make us grapple with these questions that that other creatures don't grapple with. And Heidegger says if we can get at that riddle, maybe that will help us understand this other big question about being itself. And so that's what makes it ontological, because it's an issue of being that he's attempting to get through. And that's what makes his existential analytic, that's what makes it authentic when we have anxiety, for example. Because it's only in moments of anxiety that we can't fall into the world that we begin to ask these kinds of questions. Or it's only maybe in a state of guilt, or certain authentic, what he calls Befindlichkeit, or attunements, that we would even begin to explore the kinds of questions we're asking. And so why do we have anxiety? Well, it goes back to these existential categories of being towards death, for example. Because we are founded on nothingness, that we're thrown into the world not knowing where we came from, not really knowing what our destiny is in any ultimate sense, not knowing if there's anything beyond the mystery of death. We're faced with only being able to be at one place at one time and not knowing how everything is going to turn out. And really, even our past in some sense is a mystery to us. We draw from the available meanings of culture as an attempt to make sense of those things. And then occasionally those available meanings of culture, like in certain states of anxiety, don't make sense anymore. They begin to break down. And those might be authentic moments where we might raise some of these kinds of questions. So Heidegger's suggesting that the very basis of philosophical questions emerges out of something that's prior to those questions, and it's our existential state.
But it sounds like it's prior, it has more to do with us, in a way, than a presumed world. Yeah, well, in a way, yeah. So it has more to do with us, but Heidegger attempts to, when he says Dasein, he's attempting to get at this, he's attempting to get us away from jumping to, is it in the subject or is it in the object? That historically, right, epistemology is that branch of philosophy which is concerned with questions of knowing. How is it that we know the truth? And epistemology is always, in modern philosophy at least, has grappled with subject-object. So we think of Descartes, I think, therefore I know, right? So subjectivity, so you get in these debates where, the rationalists argue that truth is constituted through subjectivity, and then you have the empiricists who say no, truth is discovered in the world, and we're these blank slates, and Heidegger's trying to go to a moment prior to that distinction without, that's the moment where he's doing the epoche or the bracketing. He's attempting to not start with an either prior assumption and get to a place that's prior to that split, subject-object split. So Dasein, the human kind of being, is not me subject or world, but it's both. Right.
It's just isness. This is maybe another way to put it. Just that things are. That right now I'm experiencing this background, this backdrop in the wall. I have a sense of where my body's situated in space, and my butt on the chair, my feet on the floor, right. And these are, and as I'm talking to you, I'm not, and I'm falling into our conversation. I'm not engaged in any question of, is that wall really outside of me, or is it inside? Is it a construction inside my head in some subjective space? It just is. It's a kind of bursting open of a world. And I don't ask questions of where to locate those events, either in some exterior space or interior space. But I have some a priori or presuppositions about that are implied in how I'm operating in the world. So Heidegger's trying to get at that. He's trying to go back, take a step back to what do we have to assume when we're not doing philosophy to just go about living our everyday lives. And if we could get at that, then maybe we get at maybe something that's more pure
than when we step back in our armchair and speculate. Something that's in some sense prior to, they could resolve that epistemological issue by going beneath it to an ontological mode of investigation. So that brings us back to what is in essence, well, the essence in a Heideggerian sense, right, isn't something, in a sense, it's attempting to get at what I have to already know in some implicit way, right, or live in some implicit way, in a precognitive kind of way, to just go about my business, live my life, and hang, you know. And is there something that is something enduring in that way?
But there is often that theme that it does confuse me. This idea that somehow there are these precognitive, sort of pre-processed sort of things, and somehow, like if we bracket all the rest of it, that's somehow a more legitimate knowledge. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that's not an important part of human experience, but the idea that it's somehow more legitimate knowledge is sort of just an assumption, right? It's sort of the idea that's somehow better than empirical knowledge or rational knowledge or processing the information. Well, it's like if I bracket this out, in some ways, if you're not careful, it can become kind of a naive realism. If I kind of block this other stuff out, then the world will wash over me. And I don't know if that's what they mean to say, but sometimes that's how.
Well, it could be taken up that way. I think that would be a mistake, though. Okay. I think it could be taken up as a naive realism, but it would be, I think I've found some people take Heidegger up that way, but I would argue that that's a mistake. Right. You can understand rationalism as being, in some sense, a legitimate way, one legitimate way of grappling with these existential issues. And you can see empiricism is another way of grappling with these existential issues. So they both have, in some sense, a common ground, a sort of common origin in this grappling with the mystery of being, right? Or the ultimate metaphysical question, why is there something rather than nothing, which is implicit.
But if you go back to the original sort of question that we were talking about, if you do, and I'm not saying that we necessarily need to endorse it, but just for the time being, let's assume we accept this idea that these precognitive kinds of things, you know, if you can kind of bracket out this other stuff, this noise, that this sort of precognitive stuff that's true sort of washes over you. It still then is confusing to me that there'd be a specific method for doing that that's different from what we might do in everyday life. So that when that journalist goes and interviews a bunch of people, they could possibly be bracketing out and letting these precognitive kinds of things wash over them in the same way that somebody does when they say they're sitting down and doing phenomenological research.
Maybe. I think there might be some journalism out there that has something like a phenomenological epoche going on, like where I think Robert Whittaker, who I mentioned earlier in our conversation, who wrote Man in America, is a good example of that. Right. You know, that he's taking, you know, certain presuppositions we have about mental illness, and he's trying to bracket those and explore those in a critical way. And there's something phenomenological, I think, in what he's doing there. Right. And it's something like a phenomenological epoche in the sense that he's not just falling into our everyday way of understanding mental illness. Where I think Whittaker and other journalists are not doing phenomenology as a science. I mean, Husserl called phenomenology kind of science, philosophical science, not an empirical science. There's empirical phenomenology, which is another question.